Family dinners at the Whitmore estate always felt like diplomatic negotiations, but tonight the stakes would be higher than anyone imagined. I'm Cassandra, and while my sister Delilah was about to celebrate what she thought was her greatest victory, she had no idea that her crime had just triggered a federal investigation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grand dining room of our childhood home in Millbrook Heights buzzed with the familiar tension that came with every Whitmore family gathering. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the mahogany table where 3 generations sat, pretending everything was normal. But nothing had been normal since our grandmother Evelyn passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind a fortune that had torn our family apart. I smoothed my simple black dress as I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot that had somehow become mine over the years. Close enough to be included, far enough to be overlooked. Delilah commanded the head of the table in our grandmother's old chair, her designer emerald gown making a statement that screamed success and entitlement. Her husband, Preston, sat beside her like a loyal golden retriever, nodding at everything she said while checking his Rolex. "Cassandra finally graced us with her presence," Delilah announced as I sat down, her voice carrying that familiar note of condescension wrapped in false warmth. "We were just discussing the estate matters." Of course they were. Ever since Grandmother Evelyn's funeral, every family gathering had somehow circled back to money, property, and who deserved what. The reading of the will had been delayed for months due to complex legal matters, according to the family attorney, Mr. Pemberton. In the meantime, Delilah had positioned herself as the unofficial head of the family, making decisions about the estate as if she already owned everything. "Any updates from Pemberton?" I asked, accepting a glass of wine from our mother, Patricia, whose worried expression had become permanent over the past 6 months. "Actually, yes." Delilah's smile grew wider, the kind of smile that used to appear before she told our parents I'd broken something valuable. "The will is finally being executed. All the paperwork has been located and verified." My Uncle Theodore, grandmother's eldest son, looked up from his salmon. "About time. This uncertainty has been difficult for everyone. Especially difficult for those of us who've been managing the estate's affairs," Delilah added, shooting a meaningful look in my direction. "Some of us have been working tirelessly to preserve grandmother's legacy, while others have been absent." The familiar sting of her words hit their mark. It was true. I hadn't been as involved in the estate discussions as Delilah. While she'd been playing executor, I'd been working 60-hour weeks at the forensic accounting firm downtown, building a career that had nothing to do with family money. My specialty was financial fraud investigation, ironically enough, though I never imagined I'd need those skills in my own family. "Cassie's been busy with her job," my mother said diplomatically. "She's done very well for herself at Morrison & Associates." "Oh, that little accounting job," Delilah waved dismissively. "Well, once the inheritance is settled, you won't need to worry about working so hard, Cassie, though I suppose some people prefer the working-class lifestyle." I bit my tongue, something I'd perfected over 32 years of being Delilah's younger sister. She was only 3 years older, but she'd always acted like a decade separated us. In her mind, I was forever the awkward teenager, while she was the sophisticated woman of the world. Never mind that her sophistication was funded entirely by Preston's trust fund and their collection of credit cards. Speaking of the inheritance, Preston chimed in, adjusting his silk tie. "Delilah has been amazing at organizing all the documentation. You wouldn't believe how many papers Evelyn had scattered around that old house." "Grandmother Evelyn was very organized," I said quietly. "She kept meticulous records of everything." "Well, apparently not meticulous enough," Delilah laughed. "You should have seen the chaos in her study, papers everywhere, multiple versions of documents, some dating back decades. Thank goodness I was able to sort through it all and locate the most recent, legally binding versions." Something cold settled in my stomach. Grandmother Evelyn was many things, but disorganized wasn't one of them. Her study had been her sanctuary, every document filed with military precision. I'd spent countless afternoons there as a child, watching her work, learning about the family business investments that had built our wealth over 3 generations.
Where exactly did you find these documents? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. In the safe, of course, Delilah replied quickly. Behind that awful painting of great-grandfather. Took us forever to find the combination, but Preston's locksmith friend was able to help.
My blood pressure spiked. I knew the combination to that safe. Grandmother had given it to me on my 25th birthday, along with instructions about certain documents she wanted me to have. Documents that were supposed to stay between us until the time was right, as she'd put it. I'd checked the safe 3 days after the funeral, and it had been empty, except for some old photographs and jewelry. Interesting, I said, taking a sip of wine to steady myself. I didn't realize you'd accessed the safe. When was this? Oh, weeks ago, Delilah said airily. I've been handling all the estate business, remember? Someone had to take responsibility. The conversation moved on to other topics. Preston's latest golf tournament, Uncle Theodore's retirement plans, my mother's garden club activities. But I couldn't focus on anything except the growing certainty that something was very wrong. Delilah's story didn't add up, and the triumphant gleam in her eyes reminded me of every childhood victory she'd stolen from me. As dessert was served, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down discreetly and nearly choked on my wine. The message was from Agent Rivera, my contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We'd worked together on several cases over the years, and she'd become something of a mentor and friend. Hey, Cassie, got your message about those suspicious financial transfers. Very interesting timing with your family situation. Can we meet tomorrow? This might be bigger than you think. I stared at the message, my heart racing. 3 weeks ago, I'd noticed some unusual activity in grandmother's accounts. Large transfers to offshore holdings that didn't match her usual investment patterns. I'd mention it to Agent Rivera during a routine case consultation, more out of professional curiosity than suspicion. But now, with Delilah's strange story about finding documents and accessing the safe... Everything all right, dear? My mother asked, noticing my expression. Just work, I managed, slipping my phone back into my purse. You know how it is. Still fighting financial crime? Uncle Theodore asked with genuine interest. Your grandmother was so proud of your career, said you had a nose for finding the truth. Delilah's fork clinked against her plate a little too loudly. Speaking of truth, there's something else about the inheritance I should mention. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to her. This was it, the moment she'd been building toward all evening. The bulk of the estate, the house, the investment portfolio, and the business interests, it's all coming to Preston and me. She reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. Grandmother recognized that we're in the best position to maintain the family legacy. Of course, there are smaller provisions for everyone else. My Uncle Theodore frowned. That seems unusual. Mother always spoke about keeping things equal among the grandchildren. Well, people change their minds, especially when they see which family members are really committed to carrying on the Whitmore name and traditions. I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole. This was completely opposite to every conversation I'd ever had with grandmother about her wishes. She had specifically told me that she wanted the estate divided equally among her children and grandchildren, with special provisions for charitable giving that had been close to her heart. But as I looked around the table at my family's faces, some shocked, some resigned, all clearly uncomfortable, I realized that Delilah had positioned this as a done deal. The paperwork was verified, the attorney had apparently signed off, and who was I to question the sister who'd been managing everything? Except, I wasn't just any sister. I was a forensic accountant who specialized in exactly this kind of financial manipulation. And I had an FBI contact who was very interested in those suspicious transfers I'd discovered.
As the evening wound down and family members began making their excuses to leave, I hugged everyone goodbye with a smile that felt like glass. Delilah accepted my congratulations on her inheritance with the gracious condescension of a queen accepting tribute from a peasant. If you want the audio version of my stories, subscribe to our channel and you can listen to them too. I hope there are no hard feelings, Cassie. I know this might be disappointing, but grandmother knew what she was doing. Some people are just better suited for managing wealth and responsibility. I replied sweetly, "Of course. I'm sure everything is exactly as it should be." As I drove away from the Millbrook Heights estate, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Agent Rivera. "Actually, can we meet tonight? I've been digging into those transfers you mentioned. We need to talk ASAP." I smiled for the first time all evening, making a U-turn toward downtown. Delilah thought she'd won the game, but she had no idea that her little sister had just become the most dangerous person in her world. Some people were indeed better suited for managing wealth and responsibility. They were also better suited for catching thieves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The fluorescent lights in Agent Rivera's office cast harsh shadows across the financial documents spread between us like evidence at a crime scene. It was past midnight, but the FBI field office in downtown Riverside hummed with activity. Financial crimes never slept. "Cassie, what you've stumbled onto here is bigger than family drama," Agent Rivera said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. Her usually perfect black hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her reading glasses had left red marks on her nose. "These transfers your grandmother supposedly made, they match a pattern we've been tracking for months." I opened the folder, my forensic accountant training automatically cataloging the bank statements, wire transfer records, and offshore account details. The numbers told a story that made my stomach drop. $2.8 million, I whispered, staring at the transfer amounts. That's nearly a third of grandmother's liquid assets. Transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland over the past 4 months, Rivera confirmed, all bearing your grandmother's digital signature and account access codes. The problem is the dates, I finished, my blood running cold. 3 of these transfers happened after she died. Rivera nodded grimly. Evelyn Whitmore passed away on March 15th. These transfers occurred on March 22nd, April 3rd, and April 18th. Someone's been very busy with her accounts. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents. Everything looked legitimate on the surface. The right account numbers, proper authorization codes, even grandmother's distinctive digital signature that she'd used for years. But I knew something the bank didn't. Grandmother had been in a coma for her final 2 weeks, unable to access anything, let alone authorize major financial transfers. "There's more," Rivera said, pulling out another file. "We received a tip 3 weeks ago about suspicious activity in several high-net-worth estates in the Millbrook Heights area. Rich families, recently deceased patriarchs or matriarchs, and mysteriously altered inheritance documents. Your grandmother's estate wasn't on our radar until you mentioned those unusual transfers. You think this is part of a larger scheme? I think your sister has been busier than you know." Rivera's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with a frown. "Actually, we're about to find out just how busy. My team has been monitoring certain activities since you called, and we just got some very interesting information." The door to Rivera's office opened, and Agent Martinez entered carrying a tablet and wearing the grim expression of someone bearing bad news. "Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this," he said, setting the tablet between us. "We just finished analyzing the Whitmore estate documents that were filed with probate court yesterday. On the screen was a PDF of what appeared to be Grandmother Evelyn's last will and testament. I'd never seen the actual document. Delilah had claimed it was too legally complex for the family to review before the official reading, but something about it immediately felt wrong.
"Look at the signature page," Martina said, zooming in on the bottom of the document. I studied the signature carefully. It looked like grandmother's handwriting, the distinctive flourish on the E, the way she crossed her T's. But something was off about the pen pressure and the slight shakiness in the strokes. "This was signed while she was already sick," I said slowly, "probably in the last few months of her life when her hands weren't steady." "Keep reading," Rivera urged. As I scrolled through the document, my worst fears materialized on the screen. The will allocated 60% of the estate to Delilah and Preston, 20% to Uncle Theodore, 15% to my mother, and a mere 5% to me. Worse, it contained language I'd never heard grandmother use, formal, cold terms about demonstrated family loyalty and proven financial responsibility. "This isn't right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Grandmother always said she wanted things equal. She specifically told me about charitable provisions for the Children's Hospital and the literacy foundations she's supported. None of that is mentioned here." "What else did she tell you?" Rivera asked, leaning forward. "She said," I hesitated, remembering conversations I thought were private between a granddaughter and her beloved grandmother. "She said she was worried about Delilah's spending habits, about Preston's gambling problems. She was concerned they'd burn through money without thinking about the family's future." Martinez and Rivera exchanged a meaningful look. "What aren't you telling me?" I demanded. Rivera sighed. "We've been investigating Preston Hartwell for the past 6 months. He owes significant money to some very dangerous people in Las Vegas, the kind of people who don't accept late payments." The room spun around me. "How much money?" "Conservative estimate, about $3 million. The exact amount that had been mysteriously transferred from grandmother's accounts. "So you think they—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "We think your sister and her husband orchestrated a very sophisticated estate fraud. They likely forged or coerced a new will, gained unauthorized access to your grandmother's accounts, and have been systematically looting the estate to cover Preston's debts."
My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it reflexively and felt my blood pressure spike. The message was from Delilah. "Hey sis, just wanted to let you know that Preston and I are flying to Europe tomorrow for a little celebration trip, 2 weeks in Switzerland and Monaco. We've earned it after all the stress of handling the estate. Hope you understand why the inheritance worked out the way it did. Love you." I showed the message to Rivera, who immediately grabbed her phone. "Martinez, I need surveillance on Preston and Delilah Hartwell immediately. Flag their passports. I don't want them leaving the country until we've had a chance to question them." "Already on it, boss. But there's something else. The private jet they booked, it's scheduled to depart from Riverside Municipal Airport at 6 a.m. That's in 5 hours. Rivera stood up abruptly. "They're running. This confirms everything. Innocent people don't flee the country the day after filing fraudulent inheritance documents." My mind raced through the implications. If they leave the country with that money, it disappears into offshore accounts forever, along with any chance of recovering your family's stolen inheritance. "What do we do?" Rivera grabbed her badge and gun from her desk drawer. "We pay your sister a house call before she has a chance to board that plane." The drive to Delilah's mansion in the exclusive Thornfield Estates development took 25 minutes through empty midnight streets. I sat in the passenger seat of Rivera's unmarked sedan, watching streetlights blur past while she coordinated with backup units through her radio. "Unit 7, position yourself at the rear exit. Unit 9, I want eyes on the garage. If they try to run, we need to know immediately." My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. In the span of 3 hours, my annoying sister had transformed from a spoiled brat into a federal criminal. The woman who used to steal my Halloween candy had apparently graduated to stealing millions of dollars from our dead grandmother. "You okay?" Rivera asked, glancing at me as we pulled into Delilah's circular driveway. "I keep thinking about grandmother's funeral," I said quietly. "Delilah gave this beautiful eulogy about carrying on the family legacy and honoring her memory. She cried real tears. Sociopaths are excellent actors. It's how they get away with their crimes for so long." The Hartwell mansion loomed before us, a massive colonial-style house with white columns and perfectly manicured landscaping. Most of the windows were dark, but I could see light coming from the master bedroom on the second floor and the kitchen at the back of the house. Rivera's radio crackled, Units in position, subjects appear to be home, 2 vehicles in the garage, movement detected inside. This is it, Rivera said, checking her weapon one final time. Cassie, I need you to stay in the car until we secure the scene. I know this is your family, but this is also a federal investigation now. I nodded, but my stomach was churning anxiety and something else. A cold, hard anger that I'd never felt before. Delilah hadn't just stolen money. She'd betrayed our grandmother's trust, violated her final wishes, and turned the woman's death into an opportunity for personal profit. As Rivera and her team approached the front door, I could see movement in the upstairs window. Shadows passed back and forth rapidly, and I caught glimpses of what looked like someone packing suitcases. Then the front door opened, and my world shifted forever. Delilah appeared in the doorway wearing a silk robe, her hair perfectly styled even at 1 a.m. Behind her, Preston stood in a suit, looking nervous and checking his watch repeatedly. "Officers, is there some kind of emergency?" Delilah asked with the practiced charm that had fooled our family for decades. "It's quite late for a social call." Rivera held up her badge. "FBI, we'd like to ask you some questions about the Evelyn Whitmore estate." For just a moment, maybe half a second, Delilah's mask slipped. I saw raw panic flash across her face before she recovered her composure. "Of course," she said smoothly, "though I'm not sure what federal agents would want with a simple family inheritance matter. Perhaps this could wait until morning. We have an early flight to catch." "I'm afraid it can't wait. And I'm afraid that flight will have to be postponed." That's when Delilah saw me sitting in the car, and her face transformed into something I'd never seen before. Pure, undiluted rage. "You," she hissed, abandoning all pretense of politeness. "You did this." I got out of the car despite Rivera's instructions, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. After 32 years of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated like a naive little sister, I wanted to see her face when she realized that the person she'd underestimated had just destroyed her perfect crime.
"Hello, Delilah," I said quietly. "I hope you enjoyed your celebration dinner. It's going to be your last one for a while." The mahogany walls of the FBI interrogation room seemed to close in around me as I watched my sister's world collapse through the one-way mirror. Agent Rivera had insisted I observe from the adjacent room rather than participate directly, something about maintaining the integrity of the investigation and protecting key witnesses. But nothing could have prepared me for seeing Delilah stripped of her designer armor, sitting in a gray plastic chair under harsh fluorescent lights. "Mrs. Hartwell, let's go over the timeline again," Agent Martinez said patiently, sliding another set of bank records across the metal table. "On March 22nd, exactly 1 week after your grandmother's death, 3 separate wire transfers totaling $800,000 were initiated from her primary investment account. Can you explain how that happened?" Delilah's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Harrison Cross, who had arrived at 3 a.m. looking like he'd been dragged from bed, leaned forward to whisper something in her ear. She shook her head dismissively. "As I've explained multiple times, my grandmother gave me power of attorney before her death. Those transfers were pre-authorized to settle estate debts and taxes. Everything was completely legal." I snorted quietly, and Rivera glanced at me with raised eyebrows. "Problem with that story?" I asked. "Grandmother never gave anyone power of attorney," I replied, my forensic training kicking in automatically. "She was incredibly particular about maintaining control of her finances. She used to joke that she'd rather die than let someone else manage her money." Through the glass, I watched Martinez place a document in front of Delilah. Even from this distance, I could see her face pale. "This is the power of attorney document you filed with the bank," Martinez continued, "dated February 10th, approximately 5 weeks before Mrs. Whitmore's death. The problem is, according to her medical records, your grandmother was already hospitalized for pneumonia on February 10th and remained in intensive care for the following 3 weeks. Delilah's composure cracked slightly. She could have signed it before being admitted. The document was notarized at 2:30 p.m. on February 10th at Riverside National Bank. Your grandmother was intubated and sedated at Millbrook General Hospital at that exact time. We have the medical records to prove it." I felt a cold satisfaction watching my sister's lies unravel in real time, but it was quickly overshadowed by a growing realization of just how deep her deception went. "There's more," Rivera said quietly, reading from a text message on her phone. "The forensic accountants just finished analyzing the estate's financial records going back 18 months. Your sister has been planning this for a long time." She handed me a tablet displaying a complex spreadsheet that made my professional heart race. The data told a story of systematic preparation, small withdrawals that wouldn't trigger alerts, forged authorization codes practiced and perfected over months, and careful research into offshore banking regulations. "She's been stealing from grandmother since last summer?" I breathed, scanning the numbers. "Look at these withdrawals. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, all disguised as legitimate estate management expenses." "Your grandmother was already sick, then?" "Early stages of the lung disease that eventually killed her. Delilah volunteered to help manage her medications and doctor appointments. The full scope of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow." Rivera's phone buzzed again. She answered it with a curt "Rivera here," then listened intently for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim. "Understood. Keep monitoring." She hung up and turned to me. "We have a problem. Preston Hartwell is talking." Through the glass, I could see that a second interrogation had begun in the adjacent room. Preston sat hunched over a different metal table, his expensive suit wrinkled and his perfect hair disheveled. Unlike Delilah, he looked like a man who'd already accepted defeat. "What's he saying?" "Everything," Rivera said grimly. "His gambling debts, the threats from his creditors, the plan to forge your grandmother's will. But he's also saying something else, that this wasn't their first time." The blood drained from my face. "What do you mean?" "According to Preston, they've been targeting wealthy, elderly individuals in the Millbrook Heights area for the past 2 years. Your grandmother was just their latest victim." I sank into the plastic chair beside Rivera, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "You're telling me my sister is a serial inheritance thief?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Rivera pulled up a file on her tablet. "Mrs. Gertrude Ashford died 18 months ago. Her will was mysteriously changed 2 weeks before her death, leaving everything to a distant niece who'd never visited her before. Mrs. Eleanor Blackstone died last year. Her estate was liquidated and transferred to accounts in Monaco the day after her funeral." Delilah knew these people?
She was their real estate agent, Rivera said quietly. She specialized in luxury properties for elderly clients. She gained their trust, learned about their family situations and financial assets, then positioned herself to exploit them during their most vulnerable moments. The room spun around me as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about family greed or sibling rivalry. My sister was a predator who had systematically targeted vulnerable elderly people, including our own grandmother. "How many victims?" I managed to ask. "We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests at least 6 cases over the past 2 years. Total estimated theft, approximately $12 million. My hands started shaking. $12 million stolen from people who'd trusted Delilah to help them in their final years? Families destroyed, legacies wiped out, charitable intentions perverted for personal gain? "Cassie," Rivera said gently, "we need your help to stop this." I looked up at her, seeing something in her expression that I couldn't quite identify. "What kind of help?" "Your sister's operation is sophisticated, but it's not perfect. She's made mistakes, left digital footprints, created vulnerabilities we can exploit. But we need someone who understands both the financial systems she's manipulating and the family dynamics she's exploiting. You want me to help build the case against her? I want us to help save the other families she's targeting." Rivera leaned forward intently. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence that she's already identifying her next victims. 3 elderly individuals in the Thornbrook Gardens retirement community, all with substantial estates and no close family members to protect them." The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about recovering my family's stolen inheritance anymore. It was about preventing other families from experiencing the betrayal and loss that was tearing mine apart. What would I have to do? Rivera exchanged a glance with Agent Martinez, who had just emerged from Preston's interrogation, looking satisfied but exhausted. You're going to go undercover, Martinez said without preamble. Preston's talking, but Delilah's still maintaining her innocence. Her lawyer's already filing motions to dismiss the charges based on family disputes and civil matters. We need more evidence to make the federal case stick. Undercover how? Your sister doesn't know we've uncovered the full scope of her operation, Rivera explained. As far as she's concerned, this is just about your grandmother's estate. We want to let her make bail, then watch her lead us to her next target. My stomach lurched. You want to let her go? We want to let her think she's going, Martinez corrected. She'll be under constant surveillance, her communications monitored, her movements tracked, but she'll believe she's free to continue her operation. And where do I fit in? Rivera pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. Tomorrow morning, you're going to receive a call from Mrs. Beatrice Thornbury, a recently widowed resident of Thornbrook Gardens. She's going to tell you that she's heard wonderful things about your sister's real estate services, and she's interested in discussing the sale of her late husband's properties. I stared at the card. Mrs. Thornbury is FBI? Mrs. Thornbury is a retired federal judge whose husband actually did pass away 6 months ago. She's volunteered to help us catch your sister in the act. The beauty is everything about her situation is real. She does have substantial assets, she is considering selling properties, and she is genuinely vulnerable to the kind of exploitation your sister specializes in. What's my role? You're going to be Mrs. Thornbury's financial advisor, someone she trusts to help her navigate the complex decisions about her late husband's estate. You'll be present for all meetings with Delilah, able to observe her tactics firsthand, and document any attempts at manipulation or fraud. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but the personal cost felt overwhelming. You're asking me to watch my sister try to victimize an innocent woman. We're asking you to help us stop her before she succeeds, Rivera corrected gently. Mrs. Thornbury is protected. She knows exactly what's happening and why, but the next real victim won't be. I thought about grandmother Evelyn, about the months of illness when she'd trusted Delilah to help her manage her affairs. I thought about the other families Rivera had mentioned. People who'd died believing their final wishes would be honored, only to have their legacies stolen by someone they'd trusted. How long would this take? Based on her previous pattern, probably 2 to 3 weeks. She'll need time to build rapport with Mrs. Thornbury, gain access to financial information, and set up the infrastructure for the theft. And if I refuse? Rivera's expression was understanding but firm. Then we prosecute based on the evidence we have, which might be enough to convict her for your grandmother's case, but won't stop her from targeting other victims once she serves her sentence. And it definitely won't help us recover the money she's already stolen from previous victims.
The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I could walk away and let the system handle my sister with whatever evidence they'd already gathered, or I could help ensure that justice was served not just for my family, but for all the families she'd already destroyed and the one she was planning to target. What happens to Preston? Preston's cooperating fully, Martinez said. He'll likely receive a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. He's already provided us with detailed information about their methods, their offshore accounts, and their plans for future targets. I looked through the one-way mirror at my sister, who was now arguing heatedly with her lawyer while Agent Martinez took notes. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her designer clothes and confident demeanor. But I could still see the calculating intelligence in her eyes, the same look she'd worn as a child when planning her next scheme. When do we start? I asked. Rivera smiled for the first time since I'd arrived at the FBI office 6 hours earlier. Mrs. Thornbury is expecting your call at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Agent Martinez will brief you on the technical aspects of the surveillance, and I'll be your primary contact throughout the operation. As we stood to leave, I took one last look at Delilah through the glass. Tomorrow I would begin the strangest chapter of my life, pretending to be a financial advisor while watching my own sister attempt to commit the crimes that had already destroyed our family. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some control over the outcome. Delilah had spent our entire lives underestimating me, treating me like the naive little sister who couldn't understand the complexities of the adult world. She was about to learn just how wrong she had been. The morning sunlight streaming through my apartment windows felt mockingly cheerful as I stared at Mrs. Beatrice Thornbury's phone number, my finger hovering over the call button for the third time in 10 minutes. The FBI briefing materials spread across my coffee table painted a picture of calculated deception that made my stomach churn. Detailed profiles of Delilah's previous victims, photographs of forged documents, and a step-by-step breakdown of her manipulation tactics. I set the phone down and walked to my kitchen, needing coffee and distance from the decision that was tearing me apart. Through my window, I could see the riverside skyline where Delilah was probably waking up in her own bed, having posted bail at 6 a.m. with money that Agent Rivera suspected came from one of the offshore accounts containing my grandmother's stolen inheritance. My hands shook as I measured ground coffee, the simple morning routine feeling surreal after spending the night learning that my sister was a serial predator. The FBI had released her with an ankle monitor and strict travel restrictions, but she was free to continue her normal activities while they built their case, free to target Mrs. Thornbury and anyone else she crossed her path. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and I forced myself to review the case files again. Mrs. Eleanor Blackstone, age 78, died, believing she was leaving her estate to fund scholarships for underprivileged children. Instead, Delilah had manipulated her into signing documents that transferred everything to a shell company in Monaco. Mrs. Gertrude Ashford, age 81, thought she was ensuring her late husband's art collection would go to the local museum. Delilah had sold the pieces privately and pocketed the proceeds. Each victim's story felt like a knife twist, but it was the photographs that destroyed me. Elderly faces smiling trustingly at the camera beside my sister, unaware they were posing with the person who would steal their legacies. In every photo, Delilah wore the same warm, caring expression I'd seen her use with our grandmother during her final months. My phone rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The caller ID showed Agent Rivera's number. "Second thoughts?" she asked without preamble when I answered. "How did you know?" "Because you were supposed to call Mrs. Thornbury 30 minutes ago, and my surveillance team reports that you've been pacing your apartment while staring at your phone." I looked around my living room, suddenly aware that I was being watched. "Where are you?" "Coffee shop across the street. Can I come up? I think we need to talk." 5 minutes later, Rivera sat on my couch, holding a steaming mug and studying my face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading people's deepest fears. "Talk to me, Cassie. What's really going on?" "I can't do this," I said quietly, sinking into the chair across from her. "I thought I could, but sitting here reading about what she's done to these people, I can't watch her do it again, even to stop her." "Because she's your sister?" "Because I'm terrified of what I might do." The words came out in a rush, a confession I hadn't even admitted to myself. Last night, watching her in that interrogation room, I wanted to hurt her, really hurt her. I wanted to see her suffer the way she made our grandmother suffer, the way she's made all these families suffer.
Rivera nodded slowly. That's a normal reaction to betrayal on this scale. Is it? Because it doesn't feel normal. It feels like something dark and ugly that I didn't know was inside me. I gestured at the case files. My whole career has been about finding the truth, exposing financial crimes, helping victims get justice. But this isn't about justice anymore. This is about revenge. What if it could be both? I looked up at her sharply. What do you mean? Rivera set down her coffee and leaned forward. Cassie, in 15 years of working financial crimes, I've never seen a case where the victim's family member was this uniquely positioned to help. You understand Delilah's psychology. You have the professional skills to spot her techniques, and most importantly, you have the personal motivation to see this through. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, the personal motivation. What if I cross a line? What if I do something that compromises the case because I want to hurt her? Then I'll stop you, Rivera said simply. That's why I'm here. That's why we have protocols. And that's why this operation has multiple safeguards. You won't be alone in there with your emotions and your anger.
I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where normal people were starting their normal days, unaware that someone like Delilah was hunting for her next victim. "There's something else," I said without turning around. "I keep thinking about all the times I could have stopped this, all the family dinners where I saw her manipulating people, all the stories that didn't quite add up, all the moments when I knew something was wrong but I chose to stay quiet. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? I'm a forensic accountant. I've built my career on spotting exactly the kind of financial manipulation she's been doing. But because it was family, because it was my big sister who'd always been smarter and more successful than me, I ignored my instincts." Rivera was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "What would you tell a client who came to you with that kind of guilt?" "I'd tell them that hindsight is perfect, but real life is messy. That we can only make decisions based on the information we have at the time." I laughed bitterly. I'd tell them that guilt doesn't help the victims, but action might. Good advice. Easier to give than to follow. I walked back to the couch and picked up Mrs. Thornberry's phone number. What if I mess this up? What if she sees through the setup and runs before you can catch her? What if you don't try and she victimizes 3 more families while we're building a case the slow way? The weight of that possibility settled on my shoulders. I thought about Mrs. Thornberry, the retired federal judge who'd volunteered to help catch a predator. I thought about the 3 potential victims Rivera had mentioned, elderly residents of Thornbrook Gardens who had no idea they were being hunted. "Tell me about Mrs. Thornberry," I said quietly. Rivera pulled out her tablet and showed me a photograph of a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a sharp smile. Beatrice Thornberry, age 74, retired after 30 years on the federal bench. Her husband Charles died 6 months ago after a long battle with Alzheimer's. She's genuinely considering selling some of his properties. He was a real estate developer, but she's being very careful about who she trusts. Why did she volunteer for this? Because 3 years ago, her elderly neighbor was victimized by someone very similar to your sister. The woman died believing she was leaving her estate to her estranged daughter, but the money disappeared into offshore accounts. Mrs. Thornberry spent months trying to help the daughter recover the inheritance, but the trail went cold. I studied the photograph, seeing something familiar in Mrs. Thornberry's expression, the same combination of intelligence and determination that I admired in my grandmother. "She's not actually vulnerable, is she?" Rivera smiled. "Beatrice Thornberry is probably the least vulnerable person your sister could target. She spent 30 years sending white-collar criminals to federal prison. But she looks exactly like the kind of victim Delilah prefers. Recently widowed, wealthy, and apparently alone." "What about the other potential victims, the real ones?" "We've already contacted them through their families. They're being moved to a secure facility under the guise of a temporary health evaluation. They're safe, but they don't know why." The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I barely noticed. The scope of the FBI's operation was becoming clear. They weren't just trying to catch Delilah in the act, they were systematically protecting every possible target while building an airtight case. "How long have you been planning this?" Clear as crystal came Rivera's voice through the nearly invisible earpiece. "Remember, we're just here to observe and document. Mrs. Thornberry knows exactly what she's doing." I checked my watch. 1:55 p.m. In 5 minutes, I would walk into that building and meet the woman who had volunteered to be bait in an FBI operation. The retired federal judge who had spent 30 years putting criminals behind bars and was now willing to risk her safety to catch one more. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to receive guidance from someone who understood justice better than almost anyone alive, while I struggled with the difference between justice and revenge. My phone buzzed with a text from Delilah. "Running 5 minutes late, but so excited to meet Mrs. Thornberry. This could be the deal that changes everything for our family. Love you, sis." Even now, she was still trying to include me in her narrative, still painting herself as the family's financial savior. The manipulation was so automatic, so deeply ingrained that I wondered if she even realized she was doing it anymore. Target approaching from the east parking lot. Black Mercedes, license plate matches our surveillance data. Through my passenger window, I watched my sister emerge from her car looking every inch the successful real estate professional. Designer suit, perfectly styled hair, briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved with the confident stride of someone who owned the world, completely unaware that federal agents were documenting her every step. "Showtime," I whispered, then stepped out of my car and walked toward the building. The lobby of Thornbrook Gardens could have belonged to a five-star hotel. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of understated elegance that whispered old money. A receptionist with kind eyes and silver hair directed me to the private consultation room where Mrs. Thornbury was waiting. I knocked softly on the door, then entered, to find a woman who commanded immediate respect without saying a word. Beatrice Thornbury sat behind a polished conference table, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a navy blue suit that spoke of quality rather than flash. But it was her eyes that stopped me. Sharp, intelligent, and filled with the kind of quiet strength that comes from facing down the worst humanity has to offer and refusing to blink. "Miss Whitmore," she said, rising to shake my hand. Her grip was firm, her voice warm, but with an underlying steel that reminded me exactly who I was dealing with. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, sit down." As I settled into the chair across from her, I noticed the way she'd arranged the space. Documents spread strategically across the table, a legal pad positioned for easy note-taking, and a water glass placed precisely where nervous hands might reach for it. Even playing the role of a vulnerable widow, she was controlling every detail. "Before Miss Hartwell arrives," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I understand this is extraordinarily difficult for you. What your sister has done to your family, to those other families, it takes tremendous courage to be here. I'm not feeling very courageous right now. Mostly I'm terrified that I'll do something to mess this up." Mrs. Thornbury leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same intensity I'd seen in photographs of her on the federal bench. "May I share something with you, Miss Whitmore? A story from my early days as a prosecutor." I nodded, grateful for anything that might steady my nerves. 25 years ago, I was assigned to prosecute a man who had defrauded elderly investors out of their retirement savings. The case was complex, the evidence was circumstantial, and everyone told me I should accept a plea deal. But one of the victims was my own uncle, a proud man who had trusted this criminal with his life savings because they attended the same church. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a document on the table. "I was consumed with anger, Miss Whitmore, not the righteous anger of a prosecutor seeking justice, but the personal rage of a niece who wanted to see her uncle's betrayer suffer. My supervisors were concerned that my personal connection would compromise the case." "What did you do?" I almost recused myself. I was sitting in my car outside the courthouse, resignation letter in my hand, when my uncle called me. Do you know what he said? I shook my head. He said, "Beatrice, I didn't raise you to run from hard things, and I didn't get cheated so you could give up the fight." He told me that my anger was a tool, not a weakness, but only if I learned to use it properly. The room was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic outside. Mrs. Thornbury's words settled into my chest like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was trying to solve. "Did you win the case?" I did, but more importantly, I learned the difference between personal vengeance and systemic justice. Personal vengeance is about making one person pay for their crimes. Systemic justice is about ensuring that their crimes can never happen again.
Before I could respond, there was a knock on the door. My stomach lurched as I recognized the familiar pattern. 2 quick raps, followed by a pause, the way Delilah had announced herself since childhood. "That would be Ms. Hartwell," Mrs. Thornberry said, her entire demeanor shifting subtly. The sharp intelligence remained, but it was now hidden behind a mask of gentle confusion and elderly vulnerability. "Are you ready?" I nodded, and she called, "Come in." Delilah entered the room like sunshine, all warm smiles and sympathetic energy. She moved immediately to Mrs. Thornberry, taking her hands in both of hers with practiced familiarity. "Mrs. Thornberry, I'm so sorry for your loss. Charles was such a wonderful man. Everyone in the real estate community spoke so highly of his integrity and vision." I watched my sister work, seeing her techniques with new eyes. The way she immediately established physical contact, the seamless transition from professional sympathy to personal connection, the subtle flattery that positioned her as someone who understood and appreciated Mrs. Thornberry's late husband's legacy. "And you must be Cassandra," Delilah said, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Thornberry mentioned she had a financial advisor joining us. How wonderful that she has family helping her through this difficult time." "Actually, we've only just met," Mrs. Thornberry said gently. "Cassandra was recommended by a mutual friend who thought I might benefit from professional guidance during this transition." I watched Delilah's face carefully, seeing the micro-expression of calculation as she processed this information. Her sister wasn't connected to the mark, which meant I was either a potential obstacle or a potential asset. "How thoughtful," Delilah said, settling into her chair and opening her briefcase. "In my experience, having trusted financial advice during estate transitions is absolutely crucial. There are so many predators out there who target vulnerable widows." The irony was so thick I nearly choked on it. Mrs. Thornberry caught my eye for just a moment, and I saw the faintest hint of amusement in her expression. "Now then," Delilah continued, spreading documents across the table with practiced efficiency, "I've done some preliminary research on your late husband's properties, and I have to say, his portfolio is quite impressive. The downtown commercial building alone is worth at least $3 million in today's market." She handed Mrs. Thornberry a folder filled with market analyses, property assessments, and financial projections. Everything looked professional and legitimate, because it probably was. Delilah's gift wasn't forging documents. It was using real information to build false trust. "The timing is actually perfect for selling," Delilah said, leaning forward with conspiratorial intimacy. "Commercial real estate is at a peak right now, but there are indicators that we might see a downturn in the next 6 to 8 months. If we move quickly, we could maximize your return and get you into more stable investments." Mrs. Thornberry studied the documents with the careful attention of someone making a major decision. "This is all quite overwhelming. Charles handled all our financial matters, and I'm afraid I'm rather out of my depth." "That's completely understandable," Delilah said, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "It's exactly why I specialize in helping widows navigate these complex transitions. I've guided dozens of women through similar situations, and I promise you won't have to face any of this alone." "What would you recommend as next steps?" I asked, playing my role as the cautious financial advisor. Delilah's attention sharpened as she focused on me. "Well, first we'd need to establish clear financial powers of attorney so I can handle the sale negotiations on Mrs. Thornberry's behalf. These deals can be quite complex, and frankly, the commercial real estate world can be intimidating for someone without experience." There it was, the first hook. The suggestion that Mrs. Thornberry should surrender control of her financial decisions to someone else. I felt a chill run down my spine when I recognized the exact same language Delilah had used in the forged power of attorney documents for our grandmother. "That seems rather premature," I said carefully. "Surely Mrs. Thornberry would want to maintain control over any major decisions regarding her late husband's properties."
Delilah's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. Of course, Mrs. Thornberry would have final approval on everything, but the paperwork and negotiations can be quite technical. I wouldn't want her to be taken advantage of by aggressive buyers or predatory investors. Mrs. Thornberry looked between us with the perfect expression of an elderly woman caught between conflicting advice from professionals she was supposed to trust. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we could start with something smaller. Charles had a small rental property portfolio. Maybe begin there to see how we work together." "Absolutely," Delilah said quickly. "That's exactly the kind of careful, thoughtful approach I always recommend. In fact, I have a client who's specifically looking for small rental properties as investment vehicles. We could have offers by the end of the week." I made notes on my legal pad, documenting every word, every suggestion, every subtle manipulation. Through my earpiece, I could hear the faint sound of Rivera's voice coordinating with other team members, ensuring that every moment of this conversation was being recorded and analyzed.
As the meeting continued, I watched my sister deploy the same tactics she'd probably used on our grandmother and all her other victims. The manufactured urgency about market conditions, the positioning of herself as the only trustworthy guide through complex financial decisions, the gradual erosion of the victim's confidence in their own judgment. But I also watched Mrs. Thornberry, and what I saw there gave me hope. Beneath her performance as a confused widow, I could see the steel-trap mind that had spent decades outmaneuvering criminals far more sophisticated than my sister. Delilah thought she was manipulating an easy mark, but she was actually walking into a trap set by one of the finest legal minds of her generation. "Mrs. Thornberry," Delilah said as the meeting wound down, "I'd like to propose that we move forward with a preliminary financial assessment, just to give you a clear picture of your options. Would you be comfortable providing me with account information so I can coordinate with your banks and investment advisors?" Mrs. Thornberry hesitated, playing her role perfectly. "I suppose that would be helpful, though Charles always said to be very careful about sharing financial information." "Your husband was absolutely right to be cautious," Delilah said smoothly. "But you have to understand, I can't provide you with proper guidance without understanding your complete financial picture. Don't worry, I have the highest security protocols, and everything will be handled with complete confidentiality." As I listened to my sister work, I finally understood what Mrs. Thornberry had been trying to teach me earlier. This wasn't about my personal anger toward Delilah, or my guilt over not stopping her sooner, or my desire to see her punished for what she'd done to our family. This was about ensuring that she could never do this to anyone else ever again. And for that, I needed to be more than just Delilah's angry little sister. I needed to be the professional who could document her crimes and help the FBI build an unbreakable case. Mrs. Thornberry had given me more than advice. She'd given me purpose. And as I watched my sister prepare to victimize what she thought was another vulnerable widow, I felt my resolve crystallize into something unshakable. Justice wasn't about making Delilah suffer. Justice was about making sure she could never make anyone else suffer again. 3 days after the initial meeting, I sat in my car outside Riverside National Bank, staring at the building where my sister was about to commit federal fraud while I watched. The weight of the recording equipment hidden in my purse felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and the earpiece Rivera had given me seemed to burn against my ear. "Final equipment check?" Agent Martinez's voice whispered through the device. "Audio clear?" "Clear," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. "Video recording device?" I touched the tiny camera disguised as a button on my blazer. "Functional." "Remember, Cassie," Rivera's voice joined the conversation, "today is about documentation, not intervention. Mrs. Thornberry has this completely under control." But as I watched Delilah's Mercedes pull into the bank parking lot, I wasn't sure I had myself under control. She emerged from her car carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of confident smile that had convinced our family she was handling grandmother's estate with love and care.
The same smile she'd worn at the funeral when she'd eularized grandmother's trust in family and her own commitment to honoring her legacy. My phone buzzed with a text. "See you inside, little sis. Today's going to change everything for Mrs. Thornberry's future. So glad you're here to witness how real estate professionals handle complex estates." Even now, she was managing the narrative, positioning herself as the expert and me as the naive observer. The casual condescension in that message sparked something dangerous in my chest. Not the cold anger I'd been struggling with, but something sharper and more immediate. "Cassie, I can hear you breathing heavily," Rivera's voice cut through my thoughts. "Take a moment. Remember what Mrs. Thornberry taught you." Mrs. Thornberry, the retired federal judge who had spent 30 years putting criminals exactly like my sister behind bars. The woman who had looked me in the eye 3 days ago and said, "Your anger is a tool, not a weakness, but only if you learn to use it properly." I forced myself to breathe slowly, methodically, the way I'd learned during high-pressure forensic investigations. This wasn't about my relationship with Delilah anymore. This was about ensuring that the FBI had everything they needed to stop her from victimizing anyone else. "I'm ready," I said quietly, then stepped out of my car and walked toward the bank. The interior of Riverside National was all marble and mahogany, designed to project stability and trustworthiness. Exactly the kind of environment where Delilah thrived. I found her in the private client area, already deep in conversation with Mrs. Thornberry and a nervous-looking manager named Thomas Kellerman. "Cassandra!" Delilah called out as I approached, her voice carrying the fake warmth that I now recognized as calculated performance. Perfect timing. Mr. Kellerman was just explaining the process for establishing power of attorney arrangements.
Mrs. Thornberry looked up from a stack of documents, playing her role as the overwhelmed widow to perfection. "Oh, good, you're here. This is all quite complex, and I value your input as my financial advisor." I took the seat next to her, noting how Delilah had positioned herself across the table in what body language experts would call the authority position, directly facing Mrs. Thornberry with the bank manager slightly to her side, creating a visual alliance between the two professionals against the confused client. "Mr. Kellerman," I said, pulling out my notepad, "could you walk me through exactly what documents we're discussing today?" The bank manager consulted his computer screen. "Miss Hartwell has requested that we prepare limited power of attorney documents that would allow her to handle real estate transactions on Mrs. Thornberry's behalf, specifically the sale of 3 rental properties and 1 commercial building." "And what safeguards does the bank have in place for these types of arrangements?" I asked, watching Delilah's face carefully. Mr. Kellerman looked uncomfortable. "Well, once the power of attorney is properly executed and notarized, Ms. Hartwell would have full authority to sign contracts, transfer funds, and make investment decisions related to those specific properties." "Full authority," I repeated, making notes. "And Mrs. Thornberry would need to be present for any major decisions?" "Actually," Delilah interjected smoothly, "that's exactly why we're here today. Mrs. Thornberry won't need to worry about being present for every little detail. That's the beauty of working with a professional. I handle all the complex negotiations while she focuses on healing and moving forward with her life." There it was, the core of her manipulation strategy. Take away the victim's agency under the guise of protecting them from complexity and stress. Mrs. Thornberry shifted in her chair, playing the role of the uncertain widow beautifully. "But shouldn't I be involved in decisions about Charles's properties? They were so important to him." "Of course they were," Delilah said, reaching across to pat Mrs. Thornberry's hand in a gesture that managed to be both condescending and possessive. "And that's exactly why you want someone who understands their true value handling the sales. The commercial real estate market is incredibly complex right now, and frankly, most people without professional experience end up leaving money on the table." I watched Mr. Kellerman nod along, clearly convinced by Delilah's professional demeanor and apparent expertise. He had no way of knowing that he was facilitating what would become federal fraud charges. "What about requiring dual signatures?" I suggested. "Many financial advisors recommend that for high-value transactions." Delilah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly.
That would actually complicate things unnecessarily. Mrs. Thornbury specifically came to me because she doesn't want to be bothered with every minor detail of the sales process. Dual signatures would defeat the purpose of professional management. I wouldn't call millions of dollars in real estate transactions minor details, I replied evenly. The tension in the room shifted subtly. Mr. Kellerman looked between us uncertainly, and Mrs. Thornbury maintained her confused elderly woman expression while I could practically see the gears turning behind her sharp eyes. "Cassandra," Delilah said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd used with me since childhood, "I appreciate your diligence, but this is really outside your area of expertise. Mrs. Thornbury needs someone who understands the intricacies of commercial real estate, not general financial planning." There was the dismissal, that same automatic assumption that I couldn't possibly understand anything as complex as what she was doing. It was so reflexive, so deeply ingrained, that she didn't even realize she was revealing her true attitude toward Mrs. Thornbury as well. "Actually," Mrs. Thornbury said quietly, "I think Cassandra raises valid points. Perhaps we could structure this with some additional oversight?" Delilah's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of irritation. "Mrs. Thornbury, I understand you're being cautious, but overthinking these arrangements can actually create more problems than they solve. I've handled dozens of similar situations, and the clients who try to micromanage every detail end up with delayed sales and reduced profits."
I watched her work, seeing the same patterns I'd analyzed in the case files of her previous victims. The false time pressure, the positioning of delay as financial loss, the subtle suggestion that the victim's natural caution was actually harmful to their own interests. "Mr. Kellerman," I said, "what happens if Mrs. Thornbury wants to revoke the power of attorney after it's been executed?" The bank manager consulted his computer again. "She would need to file formal revocation documents with our legal department. The process typically takes 3 to 5 business days. And during that time, Ms. Hartwell would still have authority to conduct transactions?" "Technically, yes, until the revocation is formally processed." I saw Mrs. Thornbury's eyes sharpen slightly. Even playing her role, the retired federal judge couldn't completely hide her reaction to that particular vulnerability in the system. "That seems like a significant window of exposure," I observed. "Which is exactly why it's so important to work with someone you trust completely," Delilah said, her voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "Mrs. Thornbury, you contacted me because I come highly recommended by people you respect. My reputation in this community is built on integrity and results." The irony was staggering. She was using her reputation as a shield while actively working to destroy it. But I could see how effective her approach was. To someone who didn't know about her criminal background, she appeared to be everything she claimed: successful, professional, and genuinely concerned with her clients' welfare. "I think," Mrs. Thornbury said slowly, "I'd like to take these documents home and review them more carefully. This is all quite overwhelming." Delilah's professional composure cracked slightly. "Mrs. Thornbury, I completely understand your caution, but I should mention that the buyers I have lined up are only available for a limited time. If we don't move forward this week, I can't guarantee those opportunities will still be there." There it was, the pressure escalating exactly as the FBI psychologist had predicted. When faced with a potential victim who showed signs of resistance, Delilah defaulted to manufactured urgency and implied threats of lost opportunities. "Perhaps," I suggested, "Mrs. Thornbury could sign preliminary documents today with the understanding that any actual transactions would require her additional approval." "That defeats the entire purpose of the power of attorney," Delilah said, her patience finally wearing thin. "Mrs. Thornbury, you called me because you wanted professional management of your husband's properties. Half measures and constant second-guessing are exactly what lead to missed opportunities and reduced profits." Mrs. Thornbury looked between us with the perfect expression of an elderly woman caught between conflicting professional advice. "I'm so sorry, but I think I need some time to consider all of this." "Of course," Delilah said, her professional mask sliding back into place, though I could see the tension around her eyes. "Take all the time you need, but please don't take too long. I'd hate to see you miss out on the opportunities we've identified."
As we gathered our documents and prepared to leave, I caught Mrs. Thornberry's eye for just a moment. What I saw there wasn't the confusion of an overwhelmed widow, but the cold satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just watched a suspect walk directly into a carefully prepared trap. Outside the bank, Delilah pulled me aside while Mrs. Thornberry spoke with her driver. "Cassie, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low and urgent. "That woman is sitting on a fortune, and she's completely out of her depth. If she doesn't get proper professional guidance, she's going to lose millions to predators and bad investments." "And you're just trying to protect her?" "I'm trying to protect our family's reputation," Delilah said sharply. "Do you know what it would do to our standing in this community if word got out that we let a family friend get taken advantage of because we were too cautious to provide proper guidance?" Even now, she was reframing her criminal intentions as family loyalty and community responsibility. The depth of her self-deception, or her calculated manipulation, was breathtaking. "I'll support whatever Mrs. Thornberry decides," I said carefully. Delilah studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something calculating in her expression. "Cassie, I know this has been difficult for you, with grandmother's estate and everything, but this could be a real opportunity for our family. If this deal goes well, there might be consulting fees, referral bonuses, ways for you to benefit from the relationship, too." She was trying to recruit me as an active accomplice, dangling financial incentives to secure my cooperation. Through my earpiece, I could hear Rivera's sharp intake of breath as she realized we had just documented Delilah attempting to expand her criminal conspiracy. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm just here to make sure Mrs. Thornberry gets good advice." As we parted ways in the parking lot, I felt a strange sense of finality. 3 days ago, I had been Delilah's naive little sister, always on the outside of her important business dealings. Today, I had become the person documenting her crimes for federal prosecutors.
The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back to the family dynamics that had defined our relationship for 32 years. From this moment forward, I wasn't just Cassandra Whitmore, Delilah's little sister. I was Cassandra Whitmore, federal witness, and the person who was going to help put her behind bars. "Phase 1 complete," I whispered as I got into my car. She took the bait. Rivera's voice crackled through my earpiece. "Outstanding work, Cassie. We have everything we need to move to Phase 2. I started my engine and pulled out of the parking lot, following Mrs. Thornberry's car toward whatever came next. Behind me, Delilah was probably already making calls to her fake buyers, setting up the next stage of what she thought was her perfect crime. But perfect crimes only existed when the criminals were the smartest people in the room, and for the first time in our lives, my sister had seriously underestimated exactly how smart her little sister had become. The coffee shop near Thornbrook Gardens had become our unofficial command center, its corner booth providing enough privacy for FBI debriefings while maintaining the appearance of casual meetings between a financial advisor and her client. Mrs. Thornberry sat across from me, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she reviewed transcripts of our recorded conversations with Delilah. "She's getting desperate," Mrs. Thornberry observed, marking passages with a red pen. "Look at the language patterns in yesterday's phone call. 17 separate instances of manufactured urgency, 12 attempts to isolate me from outside advice, and 6 direct challenges to my competence." I studied the transcript, my forensic training automatically cataloging the escalation in Delilah's pressure tactics. In the 5 days since our bank meeting, my sister had become increasingly aggressive in her pursuit of Mrs. Thornberry's signature on the power of attorney documents. "The buyers are getting impatient," I read from yesterday's transcript. "Mrs. Thornberry, I have to be honest, my reputation is on the line here. If we don't move forward by Friday, I'll have to recommend that you find another agent who's willing to work with clients who aren't ready to make necessary decisions." Mrs. Thornberry set down her pen and fixed me with the sharp gaze that had intimidated countless defendants. "That's not desperation talking, Miss Whitmore. That's calculation. She's deliberately increasing psychological pressure to force a rushed decision." Through my earpiece, Rivera's voice crackled with static. "Cassie, we have a problem. Delilah's not following her usual pattern." I touched my ear discreetly, and Mrs. Thornberry immediately understood, continuing to review documents while I listened.
Our surveillance team reports that she made 3 unscheduled trips to the bank this week. She's also been in contact with someone our digital forensics team can't identify. Encrypted calls using a burner phone. My blood pressure spiked. What does that mean? It means she suspects something, Mrs. Thornbury said quietly, having overheard enough through the sensitive microphone. The question is whether she suspects us specifically or just senses that something isn't right. My phone buzzed with a text from Delilah. Family dinner tonight at Mom and Dad's, 7 p.m. Important family news to share. Don't be late, little sis. This affects everyone. I showed the message to Mrs. Thornbury, whose expression darkened. She's testing you, Mrs. Thornbury said immediately. This is about determining whether you're still the controllable little sister or if you've become a threat. Should I go? Absolutely. But understand that tonight you'll be walking into the most dangerous situation you've faced yet. Your sister isn't just a con artist, she's a predator whose survival instincts are telling her that something is wrong. Cornered predators are extremely dangerous. Rivera's voice returned. Cassie, we're going to wire you for the dinner, but you need to be extraordinarily careful. If she's genuinely suspicious, she might be looking for evidence that you're working against her. An hour later, I sat in FBI Martinez's surveillance van while he attached recording equipment that was even more sophisticated than what I'd been using. The tiny devices were virtually undetectable, but they felt like neon signs advertising my betrayal. Remember, Martinez said as he adjusted the frequency settings, tonight is about observation, not confrontation. If she directly accuses you of anything, deny it completely and offer to help her with whatever she's worried about. What if she's already figured out about Mrs. Thornbury? Then we move to immediate arrest, Rivera said from the driver's seat, but we lose the chance to document her methods and potentially identify other victims or accomplices. The drive to my parents' house in Millbrook Heights felt like traveling through a time warp. The familiar tree-lined streets of my childhood looked exactly the same, but everything felt different now that I knew what my sister really was. I parked behind Uncle Theodore's car and noticed that the entire family seemed to be here, unusual for a random weeknight dinner. My mother answered the door with her characteristic worried smile, but I caught something else in her expression. Fear. Cassandra, sweetheart, come in. Everyone's in the living room.
The scene that greeted me was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. Uncle Theodore sat stiffly on the couch, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by barely contained anger. My father stood by the fireplace, his face grave. Preston paced nervously by the windows, checking his phone repeatedly. And in the center of it all sat Delilah, looking like a queen holding court, except her kingdom was crumbling around her. Cassie, she called out with forced cheerfulness. Perfect timing. We were just discussing some concerning developments regarding grandmother's estate. I took a seat next to my mother, noting how the seating arrangement had been carefully orchestrated. Delilah in the power position, family members arranged around her, and an empty chair directly in her line of sight, clearly intended for me. What kind of developments? I asked. It seems, Uncle Theodore said, his voice tight with controlled fury, that there have been some irregularities in the estate documentation. The probate court has requested additional verification of certain documents. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. What kind of irregularities? Delilah leaned forward, her eyes never leaving my face. The most troubling development is that someone has been asking questions about the timing of certain financial transactions. Someone with apparent knowledge of banking procedures and forensic accounting. The room went silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I could feel Rivera's tension through my earpiece as she realized that this had become a direct confrontation. That's concerning, I said carefully. Do we know who's been asking these questions? We're working on that, Delilah replied, her smile sharp as a blade. But what's interesting is that the questions are extremely specific, almost as if someone with insider knowledge of our family's financial affairs has been providing information to outside parties. Preston stopped pacing and turned to face me with an expression of barely controlled panic. Delilah thinks there might be someone in the family who's been talking to investigators. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. My mother's hand flew to her throat, and my father's expression darkened with the kind of anger I'd rarely seen from him. "That's a serious allegation," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. "What makes you think someone in the family would do something like that?" "Well," Delilah said, standing and walking to the fireplace, where family photos chronicled decades of seemingly happy gatherings, "let's think about who would have both the expertise to understand complex financial transactions and a potential motive to cause trouble for our family." She picked up a photo of my college graduation, where I stood proudly in my cap and gown, with my forensic accounting degree clearly visible in the background. "Someone who might feel that the inheritance wasn't distributed fairly. Someone who specializes in exactly the kind of financial investigation that seems to be happening. Someone who might have access to the kind of professional contacts who could make official inquiries." Every word was a scalpel, precisely cutting away my denials before I could make them. I realized that Delilah had been planning this confrontation for days, possibly since our meeting at the bank when I had asked too many informed questions. "Delilah," my mother said weakly, "surely you're not suggesting that—" "Cassandra? I'm not suggesting anything, Mom. I'm just trying to understand how outside parties could have gained such detailed knowledge of our family private matters." Uncle Theodore cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on responding to the probate court's concerns rather than speculating about family loyalty." "Oh, we're definitely going to respond," Delilah said, her eyes still fixed on me. "In fact, I've already retained additional legal counsel to investigate how confidential family information might have been compromised. It's amazing what digital forensics can reveal about someone's communications and contacts." The threat was clear. She was going to investigate my communications, which would potentially expose my contact with the FBI. Through my earpiece, I could hear Rivera coordinating with other agents, preparing for the possibility that our operation had been compromised. "That seems like a wise precaution," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I hope you find whoever's responsible for causing problems for our family." "Oh, I will," she said with absolute certainty. "And when I do, they're going to face consequences that extend far beyond family disappointment." Preston's phone buzzed, and he answered it immediately. "Yes? When? Are you certain?" His face went white as he listened. "We'll be right there." He hung up and turned to Delilah with an expression of barely controlled panic. "That was our attorney. The FBI just executed search warrants on our house and your office." The room erupted in chaos. My mother started crying, my father began demanding explanations, and Uncle Theodore stood up with the grim expression of someone's worst fears had just been confirmed. But through it all, Delilah remained calm, her eyes never leaving my face.
"How interesting," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the family's panic. "The FBI executes search warrants on the same day that we're discussing information leaks? What an extraordinary coincidence." I felt trapped in a spotlight. Every family member's attention suddenly focused on me, with expressions ranging from confusion to growing suspicion. Rivera's voice crackled through my earpiece. "Cassie, get out of there now. We're moving to immediate arrest protocols." But before I could respond, Delilah pulled out her phone and showed it to the room. On the screen was a photograph of me entering the FBI field office 3 nights ago. "I think," she said with deadly calm, "it's time for my little sister to explain exactly what she's been doing with her evenings recently." The photograph was clear, unmistakable, and completely damning. I could see my own face in perfect detail as I walked through the federal building's entrance, looking exactly like what I was, a family member cooperating with an FBI investigation into her sister's crimes. "Cassandra," my mother whispered, her voice breaking, "what is this?" The moment of truth had arrived. Not the dramatic confrontation Rivera and I had planned, but an ambush orchestrated by a predator who had sensed danger and struck first. Every person in that room was looking at me, waiting for an explanation that would either save my cover or destroy it completely. Through my earpiece, Rivera's voice was sharp with urgency. "Cassie, federal agents are 30 seconds out. Whatever you do, do not admit anything until we're in the room." But before I could respond, Delilah pulled out her phone and showed it to the room. On the screen was a photograph of me entering the FBI field office 3 nights ago. "I think," she said with deadly calm, "it's time for my little sister to explain exactly what she's been doing with her evenings recently." The photograph was clear, unmistakable, and completely damning. I could see my own face in perfect detail as I walked through the federal building's entrance, looking exactly like what I was, a family member cooperating with an FBI investigation into her sister's crimes. "Cassandra," my mother whispered, her voice breaking. "What is this?" The moment of truth had arrived. Not the dramatic confrontation Rivera and I had planned, but an ambush orchestrated by a predator who had sensed danger and struck first. Every person in that room was looking at me, waiting for an explanation that would either save my cover or destroy it completely. Through my earpiece, Rivera's voice was sharp with urgency. "Cassie, federal agents are 30 seconds out. Whatever you do, do not admit anything until we're in the room." But as I looked around at my family's faces, confusion, betrayal, and dawning understanding written across their expressions, I realized that the time of deception was over. Delilah had forced this confrontation, and now I had to choose between maintaining my cover and protecting the investigation, or telling the truth and facing the consequences. The front door burst open as federal agents flooded into the house, their badges and weapons clearly visible. "FBI, everyone remain calm and keep your hands visible." Delilah looked at me one last time, her expression a mixture of triumph and fury. "Hello, little sister," she said quietly as Agent Rivera placed handcuffs on her wrists. "I always knew you'd find a way to surprise me." The chaos that erupted in my parents' living room was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Federal agents securing the scene, my mother sobbing uncontrollably, Uncle Theodore demanding explanations from anyone who would listen, and in the center of it all, Delilah being read her Miranda rights with an expression of cold fury that made my blood freeze. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Martinez recited as he secured the handcuffs. "I understand my rights," Delilah said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of someone whose world had just collapsed but who refused to show weakness. Her eyes found mine across the chaos. "I also understand betrayal." Agent Rivera appeared at my side, her hand on my arm both protective and steadying. "Cassie, we need to get you out of here. This scene isn't secure." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of my family's complete destruction playing out in real time. My father stood frozen by the fireplace, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like grief. My mother had collapsed into Uncle Theodore's arms, her sobs echoing off the walls like accusations. "How could you?" my mother managed between tears, her eyes finding mine. "How could you do this to your own sister?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Even knowing everything I knew about Delilah's crimes, even having witnessed her manipulation tactics firsthand, seeing my mother's heartbreak made me question every decision that led to this moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Rivera said gently but firmly, "your daughter helped us prevent additional elderly victims from being defrauded. She did the right thing." "The right thing?" My father finally found his voice, and it was filled with a rage I'd never heard from him before. The right thing was to come to her family first, to give us a chance to handle this privately. Handle what privately? The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. Handle the fact that she stole millions of dollars from vulnerable elderly people? Handle the fact that she forged grandmother's will and looted her accounts? Handle the fact that she's been running a criminal enterprise for 2 years? The room went silent except for the sound of my mother's crying and the quiet radio chatter from the FBI agents. Preston, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood up. "This is all a mistake. Delilah hasn't done anything wrong. This is about family jealousy and—" "Mr. Hartwell," Agent Martinez interrupted, "you might want to consider your own situation before defending your wife. We have recordings of you discussing money laundering and offshore accounts." Preston's face went white, and he sank back into his chair. "I want a lawyer." "Smart choice," Rivera muttered, then turned back to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult, but your daughter Delilah is suspected of defrauding at least 6 elderly victims out of approximately $12 million. This isn't about family disputes. This is about systematic criminal activity."
My father shook his head violently. "There has to be some misunderstanding. Delilah's successful, yes, but she's not a criminal. She's just ambitious." "Dad," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the chaos, "she stole from grandmother while she was dying. She forged power of attorney documents while grandmother was in a coma. She turned her funeral into an opportunity to steal her legacy." Uncle Theodore, who had been supporting my mother, slowly straightened up. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. "Cassandra, are you absolutely certain about these allegations?" "I have copies of the bank records," I said, pulling out my phone and showing him the documentation the FBI had shared with me. Transfers made after grandmother's death, forged signatures, account access using stolen information. He studied the screen for a long moment, his expression growing graver with each passing second. As grandmother's eldest son and executor of her original will, he understood the financial documentation better than anyone. "These transfers," he said slowly, "they're for amounts that Evelyn never would have authorized. She was incredibly conservative with large expenditures." "Because they weren't authorized by her," I said. "They were authorized by someone using her accounts after she died." Delilah, who had been standing silently while the agents processed her arrest, finally spoke. "Uncle Theodore, you know me. You've known me my entire life. Do you really think I'm capable of what they're accusing me of?" It was a masterful manipulation, even in handcuffs. She was appealing to family loyalty, to decades of shared history, to the natural human reluctance to believe that someone you love could be capable of monstrous acts. Uncle Theodore looked between us, his face reflecting the internal battle between family loyalty and growing evidence of betrayal. "Delilah," he said finally, "if these allegations are false, then proving you're innocent should be straightforward. The financial records will speak for themselves." "The financial records have been manipulated," she said immediately. "Anyone with forensic accounting skills could have altered digital transactions to create false evidence." She was looking directly at me as she spoke, and I realized she was trying to implicate me in manufacturing evidence against her. Even facing federal charges, she was still working every angle, still trying to control the narrative. "That's enough," Rivera said sharply. "Mrs. Hartwell, you'll have plenty of opportunity to present your defense to a federal judge." As the agents prepared to escort Delilah from the house, she stopped directly in front of me. The federal agents tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but she simply stood there, studying my face with an expression I couldn't read. "You know what the saddest part is, Cassie?" she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for our family to hear. "I actually believed you were finally growing up, finally developing some sophistication and business sense. I was even thinking about bringing you in on some real opportunities." The words were poison wrapped in fake affection, designed to make me question my own actions by suggesting I'd lost some imaginary chance at success and family acceptance. But I guess some people are just meant to be followers, not leaders. Some people are just meant to tear down what others build. "What others build?" The words exploded out of me with a force that surprised everyone in the room. "You didn't build anything, Delilah. You stole it. You stole from dying elderly people who trusted you. You stole from our own grandmother while she was dying in a hospital bed." "Allegedly," her lawyer, who had just arrived, said sharply. "My client allegedly committed these acts, which we will vigorously contest." "No," I said, my voice growing stronger.
Not allegedly, definitively. I have recordings of her trying to manipulate Mrs. Thornbury. I have bank records showing fraudulent transfers. I have documentation of forged power of attorney documents. Delilah's composure finally cracked. Mrs. Thornbury? The confused old widow I was trying to help? You set me up with a fake client? Mrs. Thornbury is a retired federal judge who volunteered to help catch you, I said, feeling a fierce satisfaction at seeing her mask slip. She spent 30 years putting criminals exactly like you in prison. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the FBI agents seemed stunned by the complete reversal of power dynamics playing out in front of them. You orchestrated all of this, Delilah said, her voice filled with something between admiration and hatred. You played me. I documented your crimes, I corrected. You played yourself by being exactly who you've always been, someone who sees other people as marks to be exploited. Agent Rivera stepped forward. Mrs. Hartwell, we need to go. As they escorted her toward the door, Delilah turned back one last time. This family will never forgive you for this, Cassie. You've destroyed us all to satisfy your own petty jealousies. No, I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. You destroyed us when you chose to become a predator. I just made sure you couldn't destroy anyone else. The front door closed behind the federal agents and my sister, leaving our family in the wreckage of 32 years of shared history and false assumptions.
My mother looked at me with eyes that held both heartbreak and something that might have been pride. Did she really steal from your grandmother? I nodded, unable to trust my voice. And from other elderly people? I nodded again. Uncle Theodore walked to the window and watched the FBI vehicles disappear into the night. How long have you known? 3 weeks, I said quietly. Since the night of the family reunion, when she announced the inheritance distribution, I noticed suspicious financial activity and contacted my FBI liaison. 3 weeks, my father repeated. You've been investigating your own sister for 3 weeks and never said anything to us? I couldn't. If she'd known the family was suspicious, she would have run. The FBI needed to catch her in the act to build a solid case. My mother stood up slowly, her face streaked with tears, but her voice surprisingly steady. Show me the evidence. All of it. I want to see exactly what she did. For the next 2 hours, I walked my family through the bank records, the forged documents, the recorded conversations, and the documentation of Delilah's other victims. With each piece of evidence, I watched their understanding shift from disbelief to horror, to a kind of grief I'd never seen before. She's been planning this for months, Uncle Theodore said finally, staring at the timeline of suspicious transactions, maybe longer. She used grandmother's illness as an opportunity. Every doctor's appointment she volunteered to attend, every medication she offered to manage, every financial decision she offered to help with, it was all preparation for theft. My father was silent for a long time, then asked, "What happens to our family now?" I didn't have an answer for that. The sister who had dominated our family dynamics for decades was gone, probably forever. The inheritance that was supposed to secure our family's future was evidence in a federal criminal case, and the relationships between those of us who remained would never be the same. I don't know, Dad, I said honestly, but I know that stopping her was the right thing to do, even if it destroyed everything else. My mother reached across and took my hand. She said, "You were brave. You were braver than any of us." As federal agents continued processing the crime scene around us, I realized that the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part was going to be learning how to be a family without the person who had defined our dynamics for so long, and learning how to live with the knowledge of what she'd really been capable of all along. 2 weeks after Delilah's arrest, I sat in the federal courthouse's victim witness conference room, surrounded by more evidence boxes than I could count, and a table full of people whose lives my sister had destroyed. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of justice finally being served. Mrs. Thornbury, who had insisted on attending despite never being a real victim, squeezed my hand under the table. "Breathe, dear," she whispered. "You did this.
You stopped her. Around the table sat the real victims' family members, children and grandchildren who had watched their loved ones' final wishes perverted into funding for my sister's criminal lifestyle. There was Marcus Kellerman, whose 82-year-old father had believed he was leaving his construction company to a literacy foundation. Sarah Beth Morrison, whose grandmother's art collection had been liquidated to pay for Preston's gambling debts instead of going to the local museum as intended. And James Fitzgerald, whose mother had died thinking her estate would fund scholarships for disadvantaged students. Each face told a story of betrayal that mirrored my own family's experience, but magnified across multiple families and communities. The good news is, Agent Martinez continued, taking over the presentation, we've been able to trace and freeze the majority of the stolen assets. The offshore accounts your sister established were sophisticated, but not impenetrable. He clicked to a slide showing bank account balances and asset recovery figures that made my head spin. Currently, we've recovered approximately $14.2 million in liquid assets, plus several pieces of real estate and luxury items purchased with victim funds. The recovery rate is significantly higher than typical financial fraud cases, thanks primarily to the speed with which we were able to intervene. Marcus Kellerman raised his hand. What does that mean for restitution? Will our families see any of this money back?
The court will order full restitution as part of sentencing, Rivera replied. Based on our recovery rate, we anticipate that most families will receive between 75% and 90% of their stolen inheritances. The relief in the room was palpable. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They represented family homes that could be saved from foreclosure, medical bills that could be paid, and educational funds that could still serve their intended purposes. Sarah Beth Morrison spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. My grandmother's art collection, is there any way to recover the actual pieces rather than just the money? Martinez consulted his notes. We've located 6 of the 8 pieces that were sold. 3 are being held by galleries that purchased them in good faith, and 3 were sold to private collectors. The galleries have agreed to return the pieces in exchange for refunds, but the private collectors are fighting the seizure orders. We'll get them back, Mrs. Thornberry said, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making such promises and keeping them. Federal asset forfeiture laws are quite robust when dealing with property purchased with stolen funds. James Fitzgerald leaned forward, his expression intense. What about the other victims you mentioned, the ones you haven't identified yet? Rivera's expression grew grim. This is where we need continued assistance from the families. Your sister's operation involved multiple front companies, shell corporations, and financial intermediaries. We believe there are additional victims who don't yet know they were targeted. She clicked to a new slide showing a complex web of corporate entities and financial relationships that looked like something from an organized crime investigation. Delilah Hartwell and Preston Hartwell operated what we're calling a wealth harvest scheme. They would identify elderly individuals with substantial assets and limited family oversight, gain their trust through legitimate real estate or financial services, then gradually position themselves to access and redirect the victim's wealth. The clinical language couldn't hide the emotional devastation represented by each arrow and connection on the organizational chart. My sister hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of our community and exploiting their trust in their final years. The sophistication of this operation, Martinez continued, suggests that the Hartwells had access to insider information from multiple sources. We're still investigating potential accomplices in the banking, legal, and real estate communities. Mrs. Thornberry shifted in her seat. What kind of sentences are we looking at? Federal fraud charges of this magnitude typically carry sentences of 15 to 25 years. With multiple victims and the sophisticated nature of the scheme, prosecutors are seeking enhanced penalties. Preston Hartwell's cooperation will likely reduce his sentence significantly, but Delilah is facing the full weight of federal sentencing guidelines. The finality of those numbers settled over me like a weight. My sister, who had dominated family gatherings and commanded respect in our community, would likely spend the next 2 decades in federal prison.
Miss Whitmore, Marcus Kellerman said, turning to face me directly, I want you to know that what you did, exposing your own sister, that took incredible courage. My father died believing his money was going to help children learn to read. Because of you, we can actually make that happen now. One by one, the other family members echoed similar sentiments. Sarah Bev Morrison talked about finally being able to honor her grandmother's love of art by creating the museum exhibition she'd always wanted. James Fitzgerald described plans to establish the scholarship fund his mother had dreamed of creating. The money recovery is important, Mrs. Thornberry said when the individual thank yous had finished. But Miss Whitmore accomplished something more significant. She stopped a predator who was actively hunting new victims. Without her intervention, we'd be looking at 20 or 30 families instead of 12. Agent Rivera nodded. Our surveillance indicated that Delilah was already identifying her next targets. 3 elderly residents of Thornbrook Gardens had been marked for approach within the next month. The weight of what I'd prevented, families who would never know they'd been saved from financial devastation, was almost overwhelming. But it was also vindicating. Every moment of doubt, every family argument, every sleepless night had been worth it to prevent that suffering. There's one more thing, Rivera said, her tone shifting to something more personal. Miss Whitmore, the FBI would like to formally recognize your contribution to this investigation. Your decision to cooperate, despite enormous personal cost, represents the kind of civic courage that makes complex financial crime investigations possible. She handed me an official letter bearing the FBI seal. This is a formal commendation that will become part of your professional record. It acknowledges your expertise in forensic accounting and your willingness to assist federal law enforcement in protecting vulnerable citizens. The letter felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. My forensic accounting career, which had always been about finding truth in financial data, had culminated in exposing the biggest lie in my own family. As the meeting concluded and families began gathering their papers and making plans for restitution proceedings, Mrs. Thornberry pulled me aside.
The court will order full restitution as part of sentencing, Rivera replied. Based on our recovery rate, we anticipate that most families will receive between 75% and 90% of their stolen inheritances. The relief in the room was palpable. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They represented family homes that could be saved from foreclosure, medical bills that could be paid, and educational funds that could still serve their intended purposes. Sarah Beth Morrison spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. My grandmother's art collection, is there any way to recover the actual pieces rather than just the money? Martinez consulted his notes. We've located 6 of the 8 pieces that were sold. 3 are being held by galleries that purchased them in good faith, and 3 were sold to private collectors. The galleries have agreed to return the pieces in exchange for refunds, but the private collectors are fighting the seizure orders. We'll get them back, Mrs. Thornberry said, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making such promises and keeping them. Federal asset forfeiture laws are quite robust when dealing with property purchased with stolen funds. James Fitzgerald leaned forward, his expression intense. What about the other victims you mentioned, the ones you haven't identified yet? Rivera's expression grew grim. This is where we need continued assistance from the families. Your sister's operation involved multiple front companies, shell corporations, and financial intermediaries. We believe there are additional victims who don't yet know they were targeted. She clicked to a new slide showing a complex web of corporate entities and financial relationships that looked like something from an organized crime investigation. Delilah Hartwell and Preston Hartwell operated what we're calling a wealth harvest scheme. They would identify elderly individuals with substantial assets and limited family oversight, then gradually position themselves to access and redirect the victim's wealth. The clinical language couldn't hide the emotional devastation represented by each arrow and connection on the organizational chart. My sister hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of our community and exploiting their trust in their final years. The sophistication of this operation, Martinez continued, suggests that the Hartwells had access to insider information from multiple sources. We're still investigating potential accomplices in the banking, legal, and real estate communities. Mrs. Thornberry shifted in her seat. What kind of sentences are we looking at? Federal fraud charges of this magnitude typically carry sentences of 15 to 25 years, Rivera replied. With multiple victims and the sophisticated nature of the scheme, prosecutors are seeking enhanced penalties. Preston Hartwell's cooperation will likely reduce his sentence significantly, but Delilah is facing the full weight of federal sentencing guidelines. The finality of those numbers settled over me like a weight. My sister, who had dominated family gatherings and commanded respect in our community, would likely spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Miss Whitmore, Marcus Kellerman said, turning to face me directly, I want you to know that what you did, exposing your own sister, that took incredible courage. My father died believing his money was going to help children learn to read. Because of you, we can actually make that happen now. One by one, the other family members echoed similar sentiments. Sarah Beth Morrison talked about finally being able to honor her grandmother's love of art by creating the museum exhibition she'd always wanted. James Fitzgerald described plans to establish the scholarship fund his mother had dreamed of creating. The money recovery is important, Mrs. Thornberry said when the individual thank yous had finished, but Miss Whitmore accomplished something more significant. She stopped a predator who was actively hunting new victims. Without her intervention, we'd be looking at 20 or 30 families instead of 12. Agent Rivera nodded. Our surveillance indicated that Delilah was already identifying her next targets. 3 elderly residents of Thornbrook Gardens had been marked for approach within the next month. The weight of what I'd prevented, families who would never know they'd been saved from financial devastation, was almost overwhelming. But it was also vindicating. Every moment of doubt, every family argument, every sleepless night had been worth it to prevent that suffering. There's one more thing, Rivera said, her tone shifting to something more personal. Miss Whitmore, the FBI would like to formally recognize your contribution to this investigation. Your decision to cooperate, despite enormous personal cost, represents the kind of civic courage that makes complex financial crime investigations possible. She handed me an official letter bearing the FBI seal. This is a formal commendation that will become part of your professional record. It acknowledges your expertise in forensic accounting and your willingness to assist federal law enforcement in protecting vulnerable citizens. The letter felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. My forensic accounting career, which had always been about finding truth in financial data, had culminated in exposing the biggest lie in my own family. As the meeting concluded and families began gathering their papers and making plans for restitution proceedings, Mrs. Thornberry pulled me aside.
How are you holding up, dear? I know this victory comes at an enormous personal cost. I don't know, I admitted. My parents are speaking to me again, but it's different now. Uncle Theodore has been supportive, but the extended family? Some of them think I should have handled this privately, within the family. And what do you think? I looked around the room at the families who were now planning to honor their loved ones' final wishes instead of mourning their betrayal. I think some crimes are too big for families to handle privately. I think some predators are too dangerous to be dealt with quietly. Mrs. Thornberry smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had learned the most important lesson. That, my dear, is the difference between justice and family loyalty. They're not always the same thing, and knowing when to choose justice, that's wisdom. As I drove home from the courthouse, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Your father and I saw the news coverage. We're proud of you, sweetheart. Grandmother would have been proud, too. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. The financial recovery was significant, the criminal prosecution was successful, and the future victims had been protected. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned something about myself that I'd never known before. When it mattered most, when everything I'd been taught about family loyalty was tested against everything I believed about right and wrong, I had chosen justice. And despite the cost, despite the broken relationships and shattered family dynamics, I knew I would make the same choice again. The reward wasn't just the money recovered or the criminal convicted. The reward was knowing that when faced with the hardest choice of my life, I had found the courage to do the right thing, even when it meant standing completely alone. Sometimes, that's the only reward that matters. 3 months after Delilah's conviction, I received a phone call that shattered the fragile peace I'd been building. It was my mother, and her voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before. "Cassie, we need to talk. Something's happened with your father." I found my parents in the same living room where the FBI had arrested Delilah, but the space felt haunted now, filled with the ghosts of family gatherings that would never happen again. My father sat hunched over a stack of papers, his face gray with exhaustion and something that looked like defeat. "Dad?" I sat beside him, noting how much older he looked. The past 3 months had aged him years. "What's going on?" He handed me a letter from Riverside National Bank. As I read, my stomach dropped with each paragraph. The bank was calling in a loan secured against the family home, a loan I'd never heard of, taken out 6 months ago for $800,000. "I don't understand," I said, looking between my parents. "Why would you take out a loan against the house?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't. At least, we didn't know we did." She handed me another stack of documents: loan applications, signature verification forms, and property assessments. My father's signature appeared on every page, but as I studied them with my forensic training, something felt wrong about the pen pressure and letter formation. "Delilah needed money for her business," my father said quietly. She said she was expanding her real estate practice and the banks required family collateral for the kind of commercial loan she needed. She brought all the paperwork here, explained everything so professionally. "When was this?" "Last summer, July, I think. She said it was just a formality, that her business income would cover all the payments and we'd never have to worry about it. She even showed us the insurance policies that would protect us if anything went wrong." I studied the documents more carefully, my forensic instincts screaming that something was deeply wrong. "Dad, did you actually sign these papers?" "Of course I signed them." Delilah explained that the bank required my signature as a co-signer, but that I wouldn't be responsible for payments. "But did you sign them here, in person, or—" My mother interrupted. "She brought them by when you were at work one evening, said she needed them back to the bank first thing the next morning. It all seemed very official and time-sensitive." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Delilah had used her access to our parents' financial information and her knowledge of my father's signature to forge loan documents. She probably practiced his signature from years of family documents, then created fraudulent loan applications to access additional funding for her criminal enterprise. "We tried to call her when the payment notices started arriving," my father continued. "But that was right around the time of her arrest. We thought maybe the bank would understand once they learned about her legal situation."
"The bank doesn't care about her legal situation," I said grimly. "If Dad's name is on the loan documents, he's legally responsible regardless of what Delilah promised." My mother began crying again. "We could lose the house, Cassie. The house your father built with his own hands, where we raised you girls, where we planned to live out our retirement." The irony was devastating. By exposing Delilah's crimes, I had saved other families from financial ruin while unknowingly allowing my own family to be destroyed by debts we didn't even know existed. "There has to be something we can do," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let me call Agent Rivera. If this is connected to Delilah's criminal enterprise—" "We already tried that," my father interrupted. The FBI says that since the loan was taken out before their investigation began, and since my signature appears to be genuine, it's considered a civil matter rather than part of the criminal case. I stared at the documents, my forensic accounting training warring with my emotional devastation. Legally, my father appeared to be responsible for a debt that would cost him everything. Practically, I knew he'd been manipulated by someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of exploiting family trust. What about the house insurance, the business insurance Delilah mentioned? My mother shook her head. We can't find any record of insurance policies. When we called the insurance company she referenced, they said they'd never heard of us. Of course there was no insurance. Delilah had never intended to protect our family. She had intended to use us as a financial resource for her criminal activities, just like she'd used her elderly victims. How much time do we have before the bank forecloses? 30 days, my father said, his voice hollow. We've missed 3 payments. Our attorney says that unless we can pay the full amount or negotiate a settlement, we'll lose everything. I looked around the living room where I'd grown up, seeing it now as potential collateral damage from my decision to expose my sister. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the furniture my parents had saved years to buy, the home that represented their entire life's work, all of it threatened by Delilah's final act of familial destruction. Maybe, my mother said hesitantly, maybe we could ask some of the other families for help, the ones who got their money back because of what you did. They might understand. No, I said immediately. Those families suffered because of our daughter. We can't ask victims of our family's crimes to bail us out of our family's debts. But even as I said it, I was mentally calculating possibilities. The FBI commendation had raised my profile in the forensic accounting community. Several firms had reached out for high-level positions, including an offer that would triple my current salary. If I took the new job, I might be able to help my parents manage the debt payments while they fought the loan's legitimacy. There might be another option, I said slowly. I've been offered a position with a firm in New York. The salary increase would be substantial enough to help cover the loan payments while we challenge the documents in court. My father looked up sharply. Cassie, we can't ask you to sacrifice your life here to fix our problems. You're not asking. I'm offering. This is Delilah's fault, not yours. You were victims just like everyone else. But my mother was shaking her head. We can't let you do that. You've already given up so much for this family. You lost your sister, you've been ostracized by half the extended family, and now you want to leave everything behind to save us? What choice do we have? I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. Let the bank foreclose? Watch you lose everything because Delilah decided to use your home as collateral for her criminal activities? Uncle Theodore's voice came from the doorway. Actually, there might be another choice. He turned to see him standing in the entrance to the living room, holding a briefcase and wearing the grim expression that had become his default since Delilah's arrest. I've been reviewing the estate recovery documents, he said, setting his briefcase on the coffee table. There's something the FBI didn't mention in their victim impact briefings. He pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. When the court ordered asset forfeiture from Delilah's criminal enterprise, they didn't just recover money from victim accounts. They also recovered assets that were purchased or obtained through derivative fraud, including debts created using fraudulent family information. What does that mean? My mother asked. It means, Uncle Theodore said with the first smile I'd seen from him in months, that if we can prove this loan was created as part of Delilah's criminal scheme, the court can void it as part of the asset forfeiture process. I grabbed the loan documents and studied them again, this time looking for evidence of fraud rather than just financial details. The timing works, I said slowly. July was when she would have needed additional capital to fund the offshore accounts. And look at this. I pointed to a section of the loan application listing my father's income and assets. These numbers are inflated. Dad's actual income last year, about 40% lower than what's listed here. She had access to our tax documents, my father said, understanding dawning in his voice. She offered to help us with our returns last year, said she knew some deductions we might have missed.
She used your financial information to create a fraudulent loan application, I said, my excitement building. This isn't a legitimate debt. It's evidence of additional criminal activity. Uncle Theodore nodded. I've already contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're interested in adding this to the criminal case as evidence of ongoing fraud, which would automatically trigger asset forfeiture provisions. My mother looked confused. But what does that mean for us right now? The bank still expects payments, and we still only have 30 days. It means, I said, pulling out my phone to call Agent Rivera, that we have grounds for an emergency court order to freeze collection activities pending investigation of the loan's legitimacy. As I dialed Rivera's number, I realized that this crisis, as devastating as it was, represented something more than just another casualty of Delilah's crimes. It was a test of everything I'd learned about choosing justice over convenience, about fighting for what's right, even when the system seemed stacked against us. Agent Rivera, it's Cassie Whitmore. We have a problem, but I think we also have an opportunity to expand the criminal case against my sister. The road back from stopping Delilah's crimes was proving to be longer and more complicated than I had anticipated. But as I explained the situation to Rivera, while my family listened hopefully, I realized that the skills and courage I'd developed during the investigation weren't just useful for exposing criminals. They were also essential for protecting the people I loved from the ongoing consequences of criminal behavior. Sometimes the road back requires fighting new battles, not just celebrating old victories. And sometimes the most important victory is learning that justice isn't something you achieve once. It's something you have to keep working for, every single day. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse facing the most difficult decision of my life. The additional fraud charges against Delilah had been successful. The court had voided the fraudulent loan against my parents' house and added 3 years to her sentence. Justice had been served, victim families had recovered their stolen inheritances, and my family was safe from financial ruin. But now, as I held the letter from the Federal Public Defender's Office, everything I thought I knew about justice was being challenged in ways I'd never anticipated. Miss Whitmore, the young attorney David Chen said across the consultation room table, your sister is requesting a meeting with you. She claims to have information about additional victims that she's willing to share, but only with you. I set the letter down, my hands trembling slightly. I hadn't seen or spoken to Delilah since the night of her arrest. The idea of sitting across from her now, after everything she'd done, felt like voluntarily walking back into a psychological minefield. What kind of additional victims? She claims there are elderly individuals who were targeted but not defrauded, people who are currently in the process of being manipulated by associates of hers that the FBI hasn't identified yet. Agent Rivera, who had joined us for this meeting, leaned forward intently. Cassie, we've suspected from the beginning that Delilah and Preston weren't operating alone. The sophistication of their financial networks, the access to insider information, the coordination across multiple institutions, it suggests a larger network. But why would she tell me? Why not share this information directly with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence? David Chen consulted his notes. According to your sister, she's tried to cooperate with federal prosecutors, but they don't believe her claims about a larger network. They think she's fabricating stories to minimize her own culpability. And she thinks I'll believe her? She thinks you'll be able to verify her claims using your forensic accounting skills, Rivera said. And honestly, Cassie, if she's telling the truth about ongoing crimes, we need to investigate regardless of her motives. I walked to the window overlooking the city, trying to process the implications. For 6 months, I'd been rebuilding my life around the belief that Delilah's arrest had ended the threat to vulnerable elderly victims. The idea that her network was still operating, still targeting people like my grandmother, was horrifying.
The irony was breathtaking. The woman who had systematically betrayed elderly victims and her own family was now upset about being betrayed by her criminal associates. There's something else, Rivera said quietly. We've received reports from 3 retirement communities in neighboring states about suspicious real estate agents targeting elderly residents. The methods match Delilah's patterns exactly. You think her network is still operating? We think they never stopped. They just became more careful after Delilah's arrest. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on my shoulders. Meeting with Delilah would mean confronting the person who had destroyed our family and stolen from dying elderly people. But it might also mean preventing other families from experiencing the devastation mine had endured. If I agreed to meet with her, what safeguards would be in place?
Full FBI supervision, Rivera replied immediately. Recording equipment, federal marshals present, and you can terminate the meeting at any time for any reason. And if her information proves accurate, we pursue the other members of her network with the same intensity we used to pursue her. But Cassie, you need to understand, this wouldn't reduce her sentence or change her conviction. This would be purely about stopping ongoing crimes. That afternoon, I called Mrs. Thornberry to discuss the situation. The retired federal judge had become not just a mentor, but a trusted friend, whose wisdom I'd come to rely on for the most difficult decisions. The question, Mrs. Thornberry said over tea in her Thornbrook Gardens apartment, isn't whether you can trust your sister. The question is whether you can afford not to act on information that might prevent additional victims. But what if this is just another manipulation? What if she's lying about additional victims to get attention or sympathy? Then you'll discover that through your investigation, and no harm will have been done except for an uncomfortable conversation. But what if she's telling the truth and you don't act? How will you feel if more families suffer because you were too emotionally exhausted to help prevent it? I don't know if I'm strong enough to face her again. Mrs. Thornberry set down her teacup and fixed me with the steady gaze that had intimidated countless defendants. Miss Whitmore, 6 months ago, you had the courage to expose your own sister's crimes and testify against her in federal court. You think you've become weaker since then? I think I'm tired of being the one who has to make these impossible choices. Justice isn't a burden that gets shared equally. It falls most heavily on those who have the knowledge, skills, and moral courage to bear it. You've already proven you have all three. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the case files from Delilah's prosecution, trying to prepare myself mentally for what might come next. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see my mother's number. Cassie, I heard about the meeting request. Your father and I want you to know that whatever you decide, we support you completely. I'm not sure I can do it, Mom. I'm not sure I can sit in a room with her and listen to whatever lies or manipulation she's planning. Honey, you don't have to do anything to help that girl ever again. You've already done more than anyone could expect. But if you think there are other families out there who might be saved... She paused, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. I keep thinking about all those families we met during the trial, how grateful they were that you stopped her. If there are more families like that... I know, Mom, I know. Just remember that whatever she says to you, whatever promises or apologies or manipulation she tries, she made her choices. You're not responsible for fixing her or saving her or understanding her. You're only responsible for protecting the people who can't protect themselves. After hanging up, I realized that my mother had articulated something I had been struggling to understand. This wasn't about Delilah anymore. It wasn't about our relationship or family loyalty or personal redemption. This was about the principle that had guided me from the beginning, protecting vulnerable people from predators. The next morning, I called Agent Rivera. I'll meet with her, but I want to establish some ground rules first. Name them. This is purely about information regarding potential ongoing crimes. I'm not interested in personal conversations, family reconciliation, or whatever emotional manipulation she's planning. If she tries to make this about our relationship instead of about protecting victims, I walk out immediately. Understood. What else? I want Mrs. Thornberry present as an observer. If Delilah's going to share information about criminal networks, I want someone with federal prosecution experience evaluating her credibility in real time. That's unusual, but I think we can arrange it. And I want to review her claims immediately with our forensics team. If this information proves false or fabricated, I want charges filed for obstruction of justice.
Rivera was quiet for a moment. Cassie, are you sure you're ready for this? I looked out my window at the city where elderly residents were potentially being targeted by Delilah's associates at that very moment. Somewhere out there, families were trusting real estate agents and financial advisors who might be planning to steal their life savings and pervert their final wishes. I'm not ready, I said honestly, but I'm willing. And sometimes that has to be enough. The resurrection wasn't about bringing my sister back into my life or rebuilding our family relationships. It was about resurrecting the commitment to justice that had driven me to expose her crimes in the first place.
If Delilah had information that could prevent additional families from being destroyed, then I had an obligation to hear it, regardless of how much it cost me personally. Sometimes justice requires you to sacrifice your peace to protect other people's lives. And sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you have to fight over and over again. 1 year after the meeting that changed everything, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Elder Financial Abuse, delivering the closing keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once been known only as Delilah's little sister was now being introduced as a leading expert in inheritance fraud prevention. The information my sister provided led to the arrest and conviction of 11 additional individuals across 4 states, I told the audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, and victim advocates. But more importantly, it led to the development of new prevention protocols that have been implemented in over 300 retirement communities nationwide. In the front row, Mrs. Thornberry sat with the satisfied smile of a mentor watching her student succeed. Beside her was Agent Rivera, now promoted to head the FBI's Elder Fraud Task Force, and Marcus Kellerman, whose father's stolen inheritance had been fully recovered and was now funding the literacy programs his father had intended. The Whitmore Protocol, as it had come to be known, was a comprehensive system for identifying and preventing inheritance fraud that combined financial forensics with psychological profiling and community oversight. Named not after me, but after my grandmother Evelyn, it had become the gold standard for protecting elderly individuals from financial predators. But the real breakthrough, I continued, clicking to a slide showing statistics that still amazed me, wasn't just catching the criminals, it was understanding that inheritance fraud is a community problem that requires a community solution. The numbers on the screen told a story of transformation. In the 12 months since the Whitmore Protocol had been implemented, reported elder financial abuse had decreased by 43% in participating communities. More importantly, early intervention had prevented an estimated $67 million in potential theft. After my presentation, I was approached by Sarah Beth Morrison, whose grandmother's art collection had been recovered and was now the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition that honored elderly victims of financial crimes. Ms. Whitmore, she said, I wanted you to know that the exhibition has raised over $2 million for victim support services. My grandmother's paintings are still bringing joy and helping people, exactly as she would have wanted. These were the conversations that made everything worthwhile. The knowledge that pain had been transformed into purpose, that betrayal had become the foundation for protection. As the conference wound down, I found myself in the hotel bar with Mrs. Thornberry, Agent Rivera, and James Fitzgerald, whose mother's scholarship fund was now supporting disadvantaged students across 3 universities. To justice, Mrs. Thornberry said, raising her glass of wine. To family, my mother's voice said from behind us. I turned to see my parents approaching, their faces glowing with pride and something that looked like peace. Mom, Dad, what are you doing here? Did you think we'd miss your keynote address? My father asked, settling into a chair beside me. Uncle Theodore is parking the car. We drove down together to surprise you. The past year had been difficult for my family. Extended relatives still struggled with the knowledge of what Delilah had done, and some family gatherings remained awkward affairs. But the core relationships had not only survived, they had grown stronger through shared crisis and recovery. How are you both doing? Rivera asked, genuinely concerned. The FBI agent had become something of a family friend over the past year. Better than we expected, my mother replied. The house is secure, the legal issues are resolved, and we've actually started volunteering with the Elder Advocacy Group in Millbrook Heights. They're teaching seniors about financial fraud prevention, my father added with obvious pride. Turns out that our experience with Delilah's crimes makes us pretty effective at helping other families recognize warning signs. Uncle Theodore arrived carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since before grandmother's death. I have news, he announced, setting the bottle on the table. The probate court has officially closed Evelyn's estate. All rightful beneficiaries have received their inheritances, the charitable donations have been distributed according to her original wishes, and the family trust is fully operational.
The relief that washed over me was overwhelming.
For nearly 2 years, our grandmother's estate had been evidence in a criminal case, her final wishes held hostage by legal proceedings. Now, finally, her legacy could serve its intended purpose. "There's more," Uncle Theodore continued, pulling out an envelope. Evelyn's estate included a provision that no one knew about, a fund she had established for family members who demonstrated exceptional courage in protecting family values and community welfare. He handed me the envelope with a smile. She created this fund 20 years ago, but the conditions for distribution were very specific. The trustee had to determine that a family member had sacrificed personal interests to protect others from harm. Inside the envelope was a check that made my eyes widen. But more importantly, there was a handwritten note in my grandmother's distinctive script. "For the granddaughter who chooses courage over comfort, justice over convenience, and community welfare over personal peace, use this to continue protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Love always, Grandmother Evelyn." "She knew!" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Somehow she knew this day would come. Mrs. Thornbury leaned over to read the note, then looked at me with the kind of respect usually reserved for fellow judges. "She knew you, dear. She knew exactly who you were and who you would become when tested." "What will you do with it?" James Fitzgerald asked. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had become family through shared commitment to justice, the FBI agent who had guided me through the darkest period of my life, the retired judge who had taught me wisdom, the victims' family members who had shown me forgiveness, and my parents who had learned to be proud of the daughter they never fully understood. "I'm going to establish the Evelyn Whitmore Foundation for Elder Protection, a national organization that provides forensic accounting services to families dealing with suspected inheritance fraud, legal support for victims, and training for law enforcement and social workers." "And," Agent Rivera added with a knowing smile, "I happen to know that the FBI is looking for a civilian director for our new elder fraud prevention initiative, someone with forensic expertise, investigative experience, and a deep understanding of how these crimes affect families." The offer hung in the air like a possibility I'd never dared to imagine. A chance to turn my personal nightmare into a career protecting others, to transform my sister's crimes into the foundation for preventing similar crimes across the country. "You'd be perfect for it," Mrs. Thornbury said quietly. "You've already proven you have the knowledge, the skills, and, most importantly, the moral courage to do the job." As I considered the possibility, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it reflexively, then felt my breath catch. It was from Delilah, sent from federal prison. "Saw the news coverage of your speech. Proud of what you've accomplished, little sis. Maybe someday you can visit and tell me about the foundation. Love you despite everything." I showed it to my parents, watching their faces carefully. My mother read it with the complicated expression of someone whose daughter was simultaneously a criminal and still her child. "What will you do?" she asked. "Nothing for now," I said, putting the phone away. "Maybe someday I'll be ready for that conversation. But right now, I have more important work to do." Uncle Theodore popped the champagne, and we raised our glasses to toast not just my success, but the transformation of tragedy into purpose. "To Grandmother Evelyn, who taught us that family legacy isn't about what you inherit, it's about what you choose to do with the gifts you're given. To second chances, and to daughters who are braver than their parents ever imagined. To justice," Mrs. Thornbury concluded, "and to the understanding that protecting others is the highest form of honoring those we've lost." As I looked around the table at my chosen family, bound together not by genetics, but by shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable, I realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the restoration of what was broken, but the creation of something new and stronger from the pieces that remained. Delilah had stolen my grandmother's money, but she couldn't steal my grandmother's values. She had destroyed our family's innocence, but she couldn't destroy our family's capacity for growth. She had betrayed our trust, but she couldn't prevent us from learning to trust each other more deeply. The woman who had tried to make me feel small had inadvertently made me larger than I'd ever imagined possible. The sister who had dismissed my capabilities had created the circumstances that revealed strengths I never knew I possessed. And the criminal who had sought to profit from other people's vulnerability instead inspired a movement to protect the vulnerable that would outlast her crimes by decades. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's becoming someone they could never imagine, using the very traits they tried to diminish to create something beautiful and lasting.
And sometimes the most profound transformation comes not from what people do to you, but from who you choose to become in response to what they've done. Justice, I had learned, isn't about punishment. It's about making sure that good ultimately grows from evil, that wisdom emerges from betrayal, and that protection comes from those who have learned firsthand what it means to be vulnerable. The little sister had become the guardian, the victim had become the advocate, and the family's greatest disappointment had become its greatest source of pride. That was a legacy worth building on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.